Welcome to the Indigo Podcast, an exploration of human flourishing at work and beyond. I'm Ben Barron of Indigo Anchor and Cleveland State University.
And I'm Chris Everett of Indigo Anchor. For more information, please visit us at www.indigopodcast.com. Okay, Ben, so today's podcast episode is why people quit and how to keep them.
That's right, Chris. And today we're going to talk about a lot of stuff. We're going to talk about the aspects of turnover and retention. We're going to talk about what the research says about all this. We're also going to talk about retention management, how you can keep good people in your organization, and some evidence-based guidelines for that. We're going to talk about something called the unfolding model of turnover to help everyone understand kind of actually what happens psychologically for folks as they're making the decision to leave an organization. And related to that, we'll talk about the idea of organizational commitment and some withdrawal factors, some different things that can happen that you can potentially notice as a leader in your folks that may give you an indication that they are starting to withdraw from the organization in some way.
Right. Just want to kind of start off with this, and preparing for this episode was kind of an emotional gauntlet for me. I came out of grad school when the economy was falling apart, right? During the Great Recession or whatever name they put on it nowadays. And I just remember seeing so many of my peers and classmates, and then also being in the National Guard, so many of my soldiers struggling with employment.
Right.
And I know that the episode is why people quit and how to keep them. But this touches on so many items, from the idea of what if you can't quit, but you really want to?
Mm-hmm.
What if you've got an elder care situation and you're stuck in a place that only has, maybe it's a small town that has one or two employers, and the company doesn't even care to retain you because, they have a long line of people that they can pick up.
Mm-hmm.
I think this stuff really, so I had a lot of feelings around this, like, so why do people quit, And we're going to go through all of this different stuff, but this really speaks to the core of our manifesto, which, if any of our listeners haven't read our manifesto, I recommend you go to www.indigotogether.com and get the link for the manifesto and read it. But this really is a values-driven proposition for organization.
Right.
Are people just chattel that you move around like subhuman individuals? Is your organization just saying, well, what's the minimum I got to do to keep people, because really I'm focused on my massive bonus or yacht in the Caymans?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think this is all very, very important, and it comes back to the whole idea that we've talked about before, and it's, in the manifesto and so forth, about the idea that, the world itself is better when people flourish at work. Work is such an important and big piece of our lives, at least in civilized society today, that if that experience is subpar or horrible for folks, then that really affects them personally. And if you want to change the world, this is me maybe getting a little cliched and so forth, but I think is really true. If you want to change the world, you do that by changing your organizations. You can start by, changing your family. You can do it by having good values and so forth. But taking that into the workplace, and the way in which you treat people really matters. And if organizations would take a hard look at this, I think that they would find that oftentimes they can fall into that trap of just seeing their employees as numbers on a spreadsheet, as people that, things that have to get managed just like any other kind of commodity that they may come across. And, the best organizations, I think, don't do that and do have a more human approach towards managing, towards leading. And when they do that, they tend to flourish as an organization, right? So this isn't just about, making the the person flourish, although that's awesome, right? They go hand in hand. And so I completely agree that this topic of turnover and retention is very personal to so many of us. And most of us have gone through experiences where we've either quit a job, wanted to quit a job, maybe couldn't quit because we had various reasons why, we had to stay there. So I completely agree with you.
Yeah, and it's funny because these attitudes, and this is where I think, yes, there are some organizations that do this well, but the reason
Hmm.
we're addressing this now here earlier in this podcast, our podcast history, is that so many organizations do this garbage, right? It
Yeah.
is just garbage, all right? And so, and it's funny because it's like a petulant child. There's a business cycle. So when the business cycle is bad, everybody's like, well, ha
Hmm.
ha, we now have slave labor, right? And you could see that in the metrics about efficiency and employee output. They were getting more done with less. And I mean, some
Yeah.
of that's the competitive landscape and globalization, but not all of it, because I've sat in those senior meetings with HR professionals describing just the most unethical, soul sucking HR strategy that you'd ever see. But then on the flip side of that, when the economy's good, like it is now in a lot of places, um, they, oh, we can't find and retain good talent. And and the thing is a lot of people aren't
Hmm.
stupid. They're wise to this act. They know that these organizations don't give a rip about them as individuals. So, oh, the economy's good. I'm just going to bilk this company for everything they're worth and bid up my salary, or, maybe I'll be more mobile. There'll be generational critiques about people won't stay in jobs or roles.
Hmm.
But uh, from a capitalist perspective, isn't that just the labor market being efficient?
Right.
And, but we're humans, right? We aren't, you know, when I look at two consulting engagements, one pays like $1,000 more a day or whatever than another one. Am I really looking at that item? No, there's this holistic items as individuals. When we go to buy a house for our children to live in, or a condo or whatever, it's not just about, price per se. It's
Hmm.
about watching your kids open presents on Christmas morning,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so I just want to highlight the human factors here, and that we're really making a plea and a call to organizations to behave ethically. Now,
Right.
you do have constraints in the business world, but these are people. You are people. We can do better. And we want to help provide a way through this episode why people quit and how to keep them on ethical and evidence based ways in which to conduct yourselves in regards to employee turnover and retention.
Great. Great. So I think that kind of takes us into our first part of this episode, which is about turnover and retention and trying to look at what the research actually says about turnover and retention. And there's a lot of myths out there, and there's a great article from a couple years ago, but it's still very, very relevant, by David Allen, Philip Bryant, and James Vardaman in Academy of Management Perspectives, and we'll put a link up to that in the show notes. But it's basically reviewing and putting together all the research on some of these myths about turnover and how organizations can use evidence-based strategies to retain their talent. And when I talk about evidence-based strategies, what we're talking about there is are strategies that are based upon social science research on these types of topics. There are decades of research, lots of data on organizations and on people's behavior in them, and using that as a way to better strategize how you're going to come up with ways to retain people and how to deal with things like turnover.
Right. And there's a gap here that
Mm-hmm.
we see. A lot of the HR strategy and things that organizations do in this space is based on anecdotal evidence or some kind of program that was left over from the person you inherited the job from,
Mm-hmm.
right? So CEOs are like, listen, you're HR, you do the people strategy part. So one, CEOs don't really have a lot of CEOs. The best ones do, but a lot of CEOs don't have the people strategy part nailed down. Like they
Right.
don't really understand how to use HR as a strategic advantage or how to empower HR to fill in their numbskull gaps in knowledge, right?
Yeah.
So you have that piece, and then on the HR side, you'll have people that they just need a program that can brief the C-suite.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we got our PowerPoint, we got our like data dashboard, and this will pass the baloney test, the sniff test, so to speak, and I can keep my job and going because I'm not empowered, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then I guess the third part of that is, there are, and it's just you know, HR is starting to bring data in house. And so they may have somebody that can go technically crunch the data, but often the times the person that's doing the data crunching or pulling data out of the systems is an analyst. They don't
Mm-hmm.
understand that HR piece. And so it's just like a prime recipe for missing it in this area.
Exactly, exactly. And one of my fears as we start to use more data for managing people in organizations is that we do that absent what we know about human behavior, right? So if I just have a spreadsheet full of numbers, I can find all kinds of correlations between things and associations between different numbers. However, that might just be something that's due to chance. It might be a spurious correlation, right? It's not something that's guided by what we think is reasonable, what types of theories we have, and evidence-based strategies we have about human behavior in organizations. And so if we only have folks who kind of have a purely quantitative approach towards data, maybe from computer science or statistics backgrounds, which those people are great, and we really need to incorporate them in our management strategies and practices. But they don't necessarily have a knowledge of psychology or organizational science. And I think that is a piece that really needs to be part of using data wisely. And then once you come up with, you say, well, the data are saying X, Y, or Z, there needs to be some smart interpretation about what to do with those findings. And that's where having a smart approach towards how humans behave in organizations really matters.
Right.
So
Right. And it's a piece of that who you are as an organization. If people get reduced to spreadsheets, I mean, it's that kind of value is going to get communicated to people, and it definitely doesn't advocate or make a place that's conducive towards human flourishing.
indeed, indeed. So this article by David Allen and his co-authors, we're going to kind of go through some of these different aspects that they raise in terms of 5 common myths or misconceptions about turnover and some other strategies that one can take with regard to those myths. What do you say?
Yeah, definitely. Lots of myths, like we were talking about. It's anecdotal people's knowledge about this. So let's talk about some of the main myths, and then let's give that evidence-based approach to, what's the truth?
Right, right. So first of all, I want to make a special note here that what we're talking about here with regard to turnover is voluntary turnover. This is people of their own volition quitting, not them being fired, right?
Yeah,
So,
you stole like 1,000 pens out of the
yeah.
out, out of the resource drawer and sold them on eBay. Okay, well, those people that they should turn over, right?
Right, exactly. So we're talking
Right.
about, especially when you're losing, good people who go work elsewhere, right? That's what we want to prevent in organizations. So the 5 myths, I'll list the 5 myths, and then we'll start to dig into each one a little bit more in turn. So myth number 1 is that all turnover is the same and it is all bad. Myth number 2, people quit because of pay. Myth number 3, people quit because they are dissatisfied with their jobs. Myth number 4, there is little managers can do directly to influence turnover decisions. And myth number 5, a simple one-size-fits-all retention strategy is most effective. So yeah, so
Nice.
those are all myths, right? I don't want anybody
Right.
to, I
You're like,
want to be
hey,
very clear
wait a minute. That's what we do at our organization.
there. It's very
Sorry,
likely.
buddy.
Yeah, those are all myths. So let's briefly discuss each one of these. Starting with number one, which is this idea that all turnover is the same and it is all bad. That is a myth.
Right. And Ben, there's different types of turnover, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
the pen thief turnover, okay, that's somebody. I know a lot of smaller, mid-sized organizations, they'll generally have a kind of, I call them as a niche role.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a mid-sized organization and you need some data analytics, maybe you have an analyst that's just in that role. But after they've been in that role for a year or two, they've probably mastered the aspects of that job, and they want to go to a bigger organization where they can stretch their quantitative muscles, so to speak.
Right.
Um, you can expect turnover in that role. That we've got a good job description, everything's happy. The person comes in and they say, "Oh, well, it's time for my growth to occur."
Right.
So I'm going to leave for a better opportunity. That's a type of turnover, right?
Sure, absolutely. And some turnover is you could consider to be good or at least functional, right? Because
Hmm.
if you have zero turnover, meaning anyone who's hired just stays there for life, or you have something kind of close to that, that a lot of people say, "Oh, wow, that's amazing. People just stay forever." Well, first of all, there can be lots of reasons why they're staying there. Maybe they don't have alternatives, but also, you are limiting the influx of new ideas into your organization.
Right.
You can kind of become stagnant if you have very, very, very low turnover. So, there are some benefits to having new folks come into your organization and bringing those fresh ideas and so forth. So, some turnover is actually good.
Right. And then, there's different costs, involved with this turnover, right?
Right.
Um, I know I worked at a Dell call center for a while, early, many moons ago.
God
Um,
bless you.
and no, it was a good job and really,
Yeah.
really good people. I definitely my first introduction to large enterprise organizations and kind of
Mm-hmm.
how they operate. And so, but a lot of people may get involved in that, and it was in sales is where I was at, and I can still remember the script. Yeah, thank you for calling Dell sales and something. What computer can I build for you today? Over and over and over. But then, a lot of people moved on to professional sales roles, and Dell had so professionalized that they made it very easy to onboard a cohort of
Huh.
phone service staff, and then very easy for them to offboard, actually.
Right. Well, that's good. That's good.
But so we're talking about cost versus bringing on a COO and your company's toxic or something, and they leave within 6 months after you paid the bajillions of dollars to an executive search committee and all that kind of thing.
Right, you're right. So, the cost definitely can vary across these different types of turnover. Some people are much more or less expensive to lose or replace. Those more senior roles definitely can be very, very expensive. Some, and like you already mentioned, many roles you can actually expect a decent amount of turnover. Now, would it be good to try to find ways to keep people in those jobs? Perhaps, right? You don't want to just say, "Well, we have high turnover in this area, and that's just always going to be that way."
Yeah, no scrutiny here.
Yeah. Don't need to
Yeah.
look any further. I would say that's probably wrong. You should look at that. And maybe after investigation, if you're realizing that, hey, this is one of those roles where people come in and they do some sort of job and they learn some different skills and then they move on. Well, maybe that is something that's just going to be the way it is. However, they should be scrutinized and looked at a little bit more closely.
And it needs to be ethical all the way, because it's
Mhm.
again, that's where that risk here is. Like, some people are more or less expensive to lose, and we tend to attach value to that as a
Right.
society, or just as we think. But yes, that's a balance sheet look, but if you want to be viewed as an ethical company and your reputation in the marketplace to be good, you need to make sure that those onboarding and offboarding of, say, a call center employee or something are ethical and value the individual.
Right, right. And so it's also important to, keep in mind, you mentioned reputation in the community. That information about what it's like to work in a company is becoming more and more transparent. This is
Yeah,
what some people,
Glassdoor.com.
it's
I
the
mean,
glass,
that's our whole business model, right?
exactly. People call this the glass door effect, where people will, and it's hard to know how reflective it is of reality, because you probably get the people who are either super excited about a company or super annoyed with the company, who may be the people who are responding and writing a review of an organization. But people do go on there and they write things about what it's like to work in an organization, and that becomes public. And people who are searching for jobs oftentimes will go and look at that and say, well, is this a place where I really would want to try to make a career or even take a job for a while?
Yeah, and we're smart enough about reviews now. We've Amazon, Rotten Tomatoes, that we can kind of tell when somebody's just being a jerk, or may have been a one-off bad experience, versus we can aggregate that data and do a decent job, at least, of guessing ourselves what it's like to work at that place.
Right. So to recap, myth number one: all turnover is the same and it is all bad. That is a myth, because there are different types of turnover. Some is actually good, or at least functional, and the costs do vary from different types of turnover.
That's right. So that's a myth. Don't believe it. So let's go to the next one, Ben. People quit because of pay.
That is a myth. And this is probably the one that I come across most frequently with, one of the ones that is most frequent with managers with whom I have conversations. We oftentimes think people are just annoyed with not getting paid enough, so they leave. And actually, people's pay level or their satisfaction with their pay is a relatively weak indicator of whether or not someone is going to quit. In fact, interestingly, the most powerful predictor of whether or not someone is going to quit is whether or not they're thinking about it.
Yeah,
it's what, and actually looking for a job, right? If you have somebody who's spending a bunch of time on Indeed.com, or brushing up their LinkedIn profile or whatever, and they oftentimes are thinking about quitting, well, that's probably a pretty big indicator they're going to quit. But also kind of going behind that, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about the unfolding model of turnover, are some attitudes. Things like job satisfaction and particularly organizational commitment. Someone's feelings of loyalty towards the organization. Those are strong predictors of whether or not someone's going to quit, above and beyond things like pay.
Right. And this isn't maybe the best example, but imagine just going, you're in a marriage relationship or long-term partnership, and satisfaction is declining, and all of these kinds of things. Maybe somebody's, they're married but they're on OkCupid or something like that. It's instead of Indeed, right? And you're like, I'm leaving. What if I gave you a Ferrari? I mean, it's just so obtuse, but that's kind of the mentality that we're talking about here. People quit because of pay. Like, oh, you're going to quit? I'll give you 50 more grand.
Right.
Yeah. The retention data, if somebody, I got a bigger offer. Oh, well, we're going to come up with a counter offer. The reason why those things derail around price is there's generally something under the hood on the psychosocial level that's driving that terminate that employment relationship type behaviors.
Right. I think back to when I was on active duty in the Navy. So I was a surface warfare officer. So I drove ships around the world and all that kind of stuff. There was a lot of cool parts of that. Worked with some amazing people. And when I was making the decision whether or not to leave active duty, and I've stayed in the reserves ever since. So I'm still around the military a lot, but when I was making that decision to leave active duty and go reserve, one thing I came across as well, you stick around and do this active duty surface warfare thing, you could get a retention bonus. And the retention bonus, I think at that time, was something like, I don't know, 75 grand or something. I mean, it was fairly substantial. I I didn't even think twice about it. I was like, that doesn't do anything for me.
The golden handcuffs.
Right. What
If
did
you
it
go
for,
that way, it's
right,
the golden handcuffs.
it is, and what did it for me was thinking more along the lines of, where I wanted my career to go, some other options that I had, as well as, some aspects of, organizational culture that I wanted to be part of, some other types of things and so forth. So, another important part of this puzzle of why people quit, in addition, aside from the pay thing, is the importance of managers and supervisors, how the work and the jobs themselves are designed, relationships in the organization. Those things are really, really important.
Oh yeah.
You
The
know, I
no, the quote, and it's kind of trite, but there's some stuff behind it, which is people don't leave companies, they leave managers.
mm-hmm.
But they
Right.
leave companies too, so that's not completely true.
Yeah, but for most people, the manager, the supervisor, is the window through which they experience the organization. When your
Right.
manager, when your supervisor is a jerk to you, you oftentimes attribute that psychologically to the organization.
Right.
Or if they're great to you, vice versa. So I don't think we should ever discount the tremendous amount that it matters for you to have supportive, high quality managers and supervisors, as well as having great relationships, on a parallel or a horizontal types of relationships with your peers. So if you have a culture of incivility and bullying, that's going to make people want to quit very quickly.
Right. Right. And another piece I want to highlight here is like we've all been in an organization where like this place stinks, but
Hmm.
my manager is awesome and I love the people I eat lunch with every day.
Yeah.
Well, that's not so bad, right? And then it's so funny the cognitive processes that go here. Oh, well, they left because they weren't a fit, or there's always some external reason that tends to, not always, but I see this a lot. It was that employee that wasn't a fit or their fault for leaving, that kind of thing. It's not you, it's me, is kind of really what's happening. You never see organizations go like, what is it about our managers, our
Yeah.
senior leaders that are making people go away? There's not that introspection. And that just feeds in that myth that, oh, people quit because of pay, or a lot of these other myths, honestly.
Right. Right. So I think it kind of brings us to myth number 3. So myth number 2 was people quit because of pay. Myth number 3 is that people quit because they are dissatisfied with their jobs. It's like I don't really, don't really. This job doesn't really blow my hair back, so I'm going to quit. That's not actually, a huge driver. It is a driver, but not a huge driver of why people quit.
Yeah, I mean, some people do that, and it could be a situation of life too.
Right.
If you're 21, just out of college, and you hop into a place and it stinks, you're like, okay, and bounce, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when you got 3 kids and a sick grandma at home,
Yep.
conducting a job search is a pain.
Yeah, sure is.
I mean, unless you're like a top-notch software developer, then the job search just kind of comes to your LinkedIn mailbox
Right.
every day, right? But, it's not something that just people do. The dissatisfaction has to be pretty high for
Right.
a whole cohort of people to say, I want to get out of here.
Exactly. Exactly. And it's important to, I think about this in terms of there are many different paths towards someone's decision to leave an organization. And we'll talk more about that more here in a little bit when we talk about the unfolding model of turnover. And I think it's even more important to consider, why people stay in organizations versus, just why they're quitting.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's take a look at, feeding into number 4. There is little managers can do directly to influence turnover decisions.
That is a myth. Fake news.
And I know it's like said every crappy manager ever.
Yeah.
Oh man, these people.
They're just gonna, we just have bad folks and they're all just gonna leave. It doesn't matter what I do.
These are low level employees. Like, what a disgusting, like,
Low
Just
level. Yeah.
yeah, I know. Like, and I use that term sometimes because, we tend to view things as a hierarchy, but we can't place that existential value, or these people don't have college degrees, or, these people can't read and write well. Well, have you designed that job? Anyway, I'll get off
Yeah.
that soapbox. I
Yeah.
already
No.
did one this morning.
Yeah. I think your point there is that everyone should be treated with dignity and respect, right? And so going to this myth that there is little that managers can do to directly influence those turnover decisions. HR practices really, really do matter, and it's not just what HR is doing, because HR is oftentimes they're kind of doing things behind the scenes and so forth, and at various points as needed, getting directly involved. But if managers aren't doing the stuff, you could have the best organization, the best HR organization in the world, but if managers aren't actually doing the stuff that HR is suggesting, and asking HR for advice on different things, or taking them up on different training opportunities or that kind of stuff, then they're not going to be the most effective manager. So those HR practices really matter. How you recruit, how you hire, how you onboard, how you train and develop, how you review performance. All of those things really matter because they really touch on everyone's individual experience of work.
Right. And lots of times I see HR people taking their ball and going home, right?
What do you mean by that?
Well, it's like, so they're not empowered by the executives, and
Yep.
so they take their ball and go home. And so some of that is defensible, right? If you can't do anything, you can't do anything. But your job is more than just going to the SHRM website and downloading a bunch of their templates and having an employment lawyer and an appropriate amount of insurance for when your managers screw up, right?
Yeah.
It's got to be holistic. You can't say, well, I put the policy out there. You have to have moments, and this is where like corporate education can be a part of the HR function, or at least a strong partner, that not only do you create the platform, policy, processes, and modalities for these managers to execute and implement, and for individual employees to interact with, you ensure the training and coaching and adoption of those new behaviors that will support those things. Now, one of those things you say, how do you recruit, select, and socialize employees, and onboarding? One of the biggest drivers of people bouncing out of organization is garbage onboarding.
Yeah.
You didn't even get to the place where your organization could drive them away, right?
Right. You just hired them and you've already screwed it up, right? I came across an organization once where, now, granted, they were going through a tremendous growth, but their onboarding plan was, we hire people to work on our factory floor, and they need to read the placard above the workstation and just do what it says. Like, that was the extent of their training.
Oh my God.
and then they realized our employees can't read. Right? It was just, oh my gosh, right? And so I think that is one of those key management moments, one of those key HR moments. How you onboard, how you socialize people really, really does matter. Don't waste all the effort you went through to recruit and select people, assuming you actually did your due diligence there. Follow that up with ensuring that people understand how to be successful, what the resources are that are available to them. And this goes all the way from, the entry-level employee all the way up to the top.
Right. And, and we talk about this throughout our podcast. Managers matter. And it's more than just having technical knowledge about the job. It's curating culture and a whole host of things. So we could do 5 episodes on that,
Sure could. And, I think it's important to just recognize, so the myth here is that there is little managers can do directly to influence turnover decisions. Well, managers can oftentimes directly influence the work environment, the training that they're advocating for to get for their folks, the rewards and recognition, how they're interacting with and supervising people, if they're nice to people, if they treat them with fairness and dignity and respect, all of that really matters.
Right. So the myth is there's little they can do. The fact is there's a lot they can do, right?
Yes.
So let's go to the next one or the last one. So number 5, a simple one size fits all retention strategy is most effective.
Myth.
Myth, false.
That's right. That's right. And I can see how it's hard especially in a busy organization with, you have limited bandwidth and so forth, where it's like, well, how are we going to keep good people? And I think it's very tempting to look for that silver bullet, to look for that one thing that's going to keep our people, keep our good people in the organization. And the tricky thing, though, is that just having a one size fits all strategy is not going to be as effective as something more situated to what the organization's context is.
Right. And the way we do things in organizations kind of lends it to this place. So,
Hmm.
let's say you come in, you're the new head of HR at a, I don't know, 3,000 person place, right?
Okay.
And well, you've inherited a bunch of systems. It'll take a whole bunch of time to change it. Maybe you don't have the project management and culture change management skill set to really drive that change. So maybe you start making a little bit of stuff, but then you're also bogged down. You're probably not staffed appropriately in your HR function. So, just keeping the 1099 sent out and making sure you chasing recalcitrant managers on their daggone quarterly or annually reviews. And, you just get bogged down in that. So it's
Sure.
easy, if you do go through a bunch of stuff, you do kind of get the retention strategy kind of baked. And this is how it is. And you might worry about, well, will this be favoritism and all that stuff? And I'm here to tell you that you can have a solid retention strategy that you don't have to reinvent every year, but you can have opportunities for it to be humanized and more effective than just something that's just a legalistic document and way you interact.
Right, right. Now, and there are a couple of different things that you can do here as an organization. And one of them we kind of already touched on when we were talking about data. So, depending on the size of your organization, you can't be an organization of 10 and really have, meaningful data analysis on your turnover. But if as you start to increase in size, and certainly once you approach, being a mid-size or larger size organization, you can absolutely use your data to try to understand what's going on. And so, doing some systematic analysis to see, okay, well, what can we look at in terms of our turnover data, and how we can uncover some clues and strategies around what's happening in the organization. We can look at the data and say, well, are there some associations between different locations of the organization where people are perhaps having a higher turnover, different levels of the organization where turnover is higher, different managers under which they work where turnover rates are different. All those things can start to inform your approach towards your retention strategy.
Right.
So in addition, and I think in addition to looking at your own data, you can also look at some specific drivers that we know from the research on all of this that drive retention. We've already talked about one of them, but that is onboarding. Do you have an onboarding process that is truly socializing people not only to what they need to do on a daily basis, but also to the culture of the organization, to the values and norms, to what success looks like around here, not only in terms of what you do on your job, but how you get things done. So looking at onboarding, absolutely critical. You can also look at what we call job characteristics. And this has to do with the way in which work itself is designed for a job. And there are 5 specific aspects, 5 job characteristics generally that we talk about. The first one is task variety. So, when people have the ability to use different knowledge and skills throughout the course of their day or their week, that's generally more satisfying than just doing the same thing over and over and over again. So looking at that. The other thing, another job characteristic is what we call task identity, right? So this is being able to see the outcome of your work, being able to see the whole thing. And one thing I always think about here is, I don't know how familiar you are with motorcycles, But
No,
there's
no clue. They look scary.
so I had a motorcycle for a few years when I was younger and childless, and I used to ride with my brother all over San Diego County. It was awesome. But there's a motorcycle company called Titan Motorcycles, and they make these. I'm not up on what they're doing right now, but at least at the time, they make these very expensive motorcycles. But here's the thing: like one person at their factory, a motorcycle expert, builds one motorcycle from start to finish. And that is, I think, a really good example of task identity because that person is, I mean, there's a lot of satisfaction that comes from that. It's like, I started with all the parts and I put this thing together and I made this awesome, beautiful piece of art that also, goes pretty fast on the road and is awesome. So, I think that's an example. But there are also, you don't have to be super inefficient and, have that kind of approach towards your work to make task identity a thing. You can, as a manager, talk about and show people the results of their work, help connect them with, the bigger impact, so they don't feel like just a cog in the wheel. So that's another aspect. Variety, identity, also task significance. We like to feel like our work matters, like we are doing something that is making the world a little bit better, or at least making the life of somebody else in the organization a little bit better, and is having that impact. So that's task significance. Another piece of this is what we call autonomy. And so autonomy is about, do you give people, direction in terms of what needs to get done, but then let them figure out to some degree how they go about it. Giving them a little bit of decision-making authority, and this can vary depending on the person and the job, but people like to use their brains. We don't necessarily like to be treated like semi-programmable robots. We like to be able to make some decisions there. And then the last piece is feedback. And so this is about, how do you know whether or not you did a good job? Now, some jobs have this as kind of part of the actual job. And what I mean by that is, you think of like, if you're a programmer, you're writing some computer program and you hit run and you can tell fairly quickly whether or not it worked. And that could be a satisfying experience of your job. You know whether or not it worked right away. So some jobs are like that where you just know whether or not you did a good job on it. Other ones, it's a little bit more tricky, and you need that feedback from the environment around you, the people around you, to help you know if you're doing a good job or not. So that has to do with job characteristics. Additionally, going into this retention strategy stuff, things like leadership, relationships, we've already talked about that, the work environment. And then, we're going to talk about this later, but watching for some of those withdrawal behaviors that people may have where they're starting to pull away from the organization is important. And finally, what I'd mention here is that there are some individual characteristics. Some people just have a personality type where they may be more likely to leave jobs. And that's something that you can't really control. And so you can't control everything, but there is a lot that you can control. So the myth here is that a simple one-size-fits-all retention strategy is the most effective. That is a myth.
Yeah, that's a myth, and those are the main drivers around that. So that that's a whole thing that you have to address is how do you have both policy, but then how do you have a flexible, resilient retention strategy that addresses the onboarding, job characteristics, etc. Right?
Right.
So Ben, let's move to evidence-based guidelines. Right?
Yes.
So if you're interested in being a pro at this thing called retention management, how do we start to put our minds around that?
Yeah, so I think there's some things that we can also draw from that same. We've been referencing and basically going through this great article by David Allen and his colleagues that we'll again post a note to. And in addition to talking about these different myths in that article, they also talk about these different evidence-based guidelines for retaining folks. And there are a few different holistic types of activities that you can engage in to better retain people. And the first one, I think, really starts at the top. And this is where, this is a job for the CEO and his or her leadership team, certainly HR, to really develop a shared understanding of what turnover is and what it's looking like in your organization, and understanding why it's important and ways to monitor it and so forth among the organizational stakeholders. So this goes, so far as defining different types of turnover, having some sort of consensus about how you're going to measure it and look at the costs of turnover within your organization. And also, developing that shared understanding of how important it is to retain people, retain the good people, right? Because if you don't have that shared understanding, it's not really going to go anywhere.
Right. So if you're in the HR function and you're like, oh, God, how do I put my arms around this thing? One of the things you can do is just kick off a broader conversation within your own team, right? Hey, guys, let's define the major food groups of types of turnover and how we want to think of them here. Involuntary, voluntary, loss to a competitor, whatever that is. Get your own language around that. There's some good stuff in the literature that might inspire some ideas, right? And then, that like we're talking about, I always say hive mind, when everybody kind of has the same the lexicon or the type of words that they use, it helps the conversation flow better. And then how are you going to cost this turnover? Price Waterhouse, PwC, right? Price Waterhouse Coopers, back in 2006, I'll just read this fact from them. The estimates that turnover-related costs represent more than 12% of pre-tax income for the average company.
Yeah.
And nearly 40% for the companies at the 75th percentile for turnover rate. So, cynically, I could say if you think money's it, I guess you could give everybody a 20% raise and still come out ahead versus have a bad turnover rate. But, we already talked how that's a myth and not the way you want to go. So, but
Right.
you need to have a way in which you guys look at the cost of turnover. And that'll actually help you get, when executives start to see like, ooh, our turnover is costing us 40%. That's a lot of money that they're leaving on the table. So you can get that kind of attention to why this is important and help develop that shared understanding, right? And that shared understanding for why this is important is both the cost and the social impacts and reputational risks, all of those items. So create that hive mind on turnover.
Yeah, because if you don't have this shared understanding that retention is an important thing in your organization, then it's not going to go anywhere, right? And that needs to start at the top. A second piece of this retention strategy that you should be thinking about is developing some knowledge of the underlying principles and some of the cause-effect relationships that we know about with regard to turnover, right? So we've talked about some of these evidence-based predictors of turnover. We'll talk about more of those. There's some different paths towards turnover in terms of how people think about it. And there's also this idea of job embeddedness, and this really comes from the research on why people stay in organizations. And part of it is that they have a lot of commitment to the organization. They are treated well in the organization. They have great managers, great coworkers, and so forth. They do meaningful work, all of that kind of stuff. But it also has to do with how rooted they are in the broader community. And so organizations that are really smart about this start thinking about this and say, hey, well, if we're getting this person to move to Northeast Ohio, which is where I live, right, which is probably less of a destination, at least right now, than maybe Park City, Utah, where you live, what do we need to do to really make sure that person stays? Well, we can highlight and we can really introduce that person to, hey, like here's the school systems. Here's the amazing things that you can do culturally in this area. Maybe as an organization, we get involved in various awesome volunteer activities. So the person then starts to build relationships that are within the community, not only just in the organization, but starts to build that social fabric that really makes the person want to stay physically in that area. So if you think about my life, like it would take some pretty serious things to make me move, because not only do I have great job and my wife has a great job and all this other stuff, but we are very embedded within the broader community here. We have lots of friends and social networks that kind of intersect in this broader region. So that's this idea of job embeddedness, which helps us understand why people do stay in their jobs. So people, organizations need to develop some knowledge of this and need to consider all of these different factors when they're thinking about their retention management strategy.
Yeah, and you're a terrible skier, so
So the last time I skied, I don't know if I'm terrible, but the last time I did ski, I think I was 4 years old, and yeah, that was when I was born in Colorado, little ski town there. So maybe I'll learn, and it'll all turn around. Who knows? Yeah. So so that's another piece of this retention management strategy. And the last piece is using some smart diagnosis and trying to adapt what you do to your organization's context. So, using the data you have to analyze turnover costs and rates and what's going on there. Do some internal and external benchmarking to see what is reasonable. Develop some retention goals for different parts of the organization. Collect data on things like, turnover, obviously, which is very easy to collect the data on, right? Did someone leave this year or whatever? But also on things like job satisfaction, also on things like organizational commitment, also things on like leader and manager satisfaction and that kind of stuff. So then you can start to put together the puzzle and figure out what's going on in your organization, and that can help you design some really good retention strategies.
Right. So just to summarize, and we'll put this graph up on the website in the show notes, but you got to get that hive mind around turnover. Have a common language to talk about it. Then you need to take a look at those cause and effect relationships. Why? Why is this happening? Are there any predictors? Those kinds of things. And then you want to diagnose, taking that shared knowledge and a look at the cause and effect, use that to drive how you're going to respond to those items.
That's right. That's right. So maybe now we could talk a little bit about, what are some of these costs? You already talked about, some of the data from PricewaterhouseCoopers on how expensive turnover can be and so forth. But I think it's important for us to break down what some of these costs are, because some of them are direct, some are indirect, and putting those into some different food groups, so to speak, I think can be helpful for folks.
Yeah. And, this is something not a lot of HR people have the core competency to do. So this would be a great time to either partner with somebody in the finance function or really get a quality consultant to come in and help you develop a model to calibrate this. So, I mean, the first one, Ben, is separation costs, right? Just straight up. So, like, what's separation costs in your view?
So these could be some really tangible things, like the time it takes for HR and the HR staff to deal with somebody leaving, right? To go through the process of doing the paperwork, of all that administrative stuff, doing an exit interview if you do those types of things. That time is money. Also, the manager's time. So, to the degree that it takes the manager time to work through that process. Also, you may need to also have some temporary coverage of that position. That also would be a tangible, direct cost related to the separation.
Mm-hmm.
But there are also, in addition to these tangible things, there's also some really important and maybe a little bit harder to measure, but nonetheless very important intangible costs related with someone leaving. And the first one is, when people leave an organization, they're not just leaving physically, but they're also kind of taking a piece of what you could consider to be the organization's memory. What types of how to get things done within your organization. All that knowledge also walks out the door. Sometimes, if a person leaves, especially if they are in sales or kind of a client-facing role. Maybe a professional type of environment, if the person, if that's your type of firm, they also may leave with some clients, right? So that's something that's really important.
And there's all this work that happens in the white space, right? That was never documented, but Billy really knew that. And there's all this organizational knowledge, like, we thought our onboarding process was good, but actually it was garbage. But these people kind of really pulled people in and made it happen for us anyway. That's now out. And then on top of that, your competitors, like if it's an involuntary separation, you really want that person now has somebody that also has knowledge of how you do things, your secret sauce, how the sausage is made, all those kind of things.
Right.
Yeah, and it can have a contagious effect. Man,
right.
Tim left. Tim was the best freaking employee we had.
Yeah.
Maybe I should Tim, how's that job over there? They meet at a happy hour 2 weeks later. Oh, it's so great. As a matter of fact,
Yeah.
they're hiring for this. And all of a sudden, uh, one departure becomes a leak, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, this other intangible cost is that, people are losing mentors, they're losing friends, they're losing teammates. And that can be a very powerful trigger in people's minds to make them start thinking about leaving. Kind of going to this contagion effect. I remember one consulting engagement I did at a large manufacturing company where I was talking with I did like a focus group with a whole bunch of the kind of mid to upper managers, and they were talking about how this one person, and this person just kept on coming up in separate focus groups, separate interviews. This one person's name kept on coming up as, well, this person quit, and I'll call him. Yeah, it's like, and this was like an amazing person, right? And so they thought, no, this is the person who would never quit, who could just keep on trucking regardless of the circumstances. And they said, yeah, well, that person quit 2 weeks ago, and it just kept on coming up and became this kind of this meme within the organization, this story that you could tell was really influencing people's thinking about the quality of the organization and whether or not they themselves should or should not stick around.
Right. So that's separation cost, but now you got a giant hole in your heart, right? A person-shaped hole, and that brings us to
I need to fill
replacement
the
cost.
hole. Yeah.
So
Exactly.
if you're a manager, and don't take this wrong, it's a pain to go sort through a bunch of resumes, interview a bunch of people, get consensus on the team on who you should move forward with, and get a rear end in a seat. Now, that's just the facts, ma'am, kind of approach, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's all that soft piece that is really the human factor that's important. But, how many HR and recruiting staff do you want? Or how much are you going to pay if you're using an outside recruiting agency? And then somebody's got to take time, or multiple people have to take time out of their day to orient that new employee. All that costs organizational velocity and capital.
Right. So those are some replacement costs. And then, I think in addition to these costs, or aside from them, it is important for us to remember that there can be some benefits to having some turnover, right?
Right.
When you have somebody leave, you might find that you don't need to replace them. And that could be a good thing.
Congratulations, Billy. You're going to do 3 jobs now. Sorry.
Yeah. I think you would want to approach that cautiously,
Right.
and make sure it's actually true, right? Don't just pile the work on everybody else, which is kind of another hit.
Is what they do, but
which is what they do, especially during the person's absence before they hire somebody new, and that can definitely be a hidden cost of turnover. You may have another benefit. You may have some new ideas or skills that come into the organization if you hire somebody good from outside. You may also create promotion opportunities. If you're a small organization, this can be particularly helpful. You have somebody leave, and maybe it's an opportunity for you to promote someone. Of course, if you do promote someone, then you also create another vacancy, and you're going to have to fill that one. But it can be a motivational thing for that employee. You might be able to pay the new employee less, right? So if the person has gone through, the person who left went through had a long tenure there, and they had a bunch of pay raises along the way, maybe we're a little bit more senior, you might be able to get somebody in there who is paid a little bit less and then can grow over time. The replacement might actually be better than the person who left.
Right.
So that's a good thing. And this also can provide an opportunity, perhaps, if you have a person or various people leave, depending on their role and their situation, you may have an opportunity to reorganize or restructure a team or certain parts of the organization at that time.
Right. Yeah. So it's just like homes. If you're in a housing market, there needs to be a certain amount of vacancies. Let's say you're newly married, you're living in an 800 square foot downtown loft apartment. You get out of your bed, you put your feet in the shower. It's so small, but it's hip, it's cool. But then you find a dog you fall in love with, and whoops, you're pregnant, right? Well, 400 to 800 square foot downtown loft might not be the best fit for you. But if all
Right.
the other houses are full, you can't move, right?
Yeah.
And so you need there's a positive feature to the labor market having some vacancies and some turnover because it creates opportunity for people to improve their lives and their work situation.
Yes. So just to bring it back to, what actually drives some of this voluntary turnover. We talked about onboarding.
Yeah,
You want to
don't screw that up. I mean, you got to get that one right so you can screw it up later, right?
exactly. Yeah. Don't mess that up. Another thing that drives it is certainly if someone's thinking about leaving and they're actually looking for a job, that's certainly an indicator. Things like organizational commitment and job satisfaction, those are important, especially the commitment piece, whether or not, and we'll talk about this another time, a little bit later, about, what types of commitment a person can have to an organization, the types of loyalty, perhaps, you can think of it that way. Relationships with supervisors and managers. Yeah, it's important.
Right? Role clarity and role conflict.
Ugh.
Hey, I thought you hired me to do this job, and Bill or Brenda over here says it's their job.
Yeah.
Or I come in, I think I know what I need to be doing, but I don't have a clear remit from my boss. I know we just see this all the time. You
Yeah.
go through all this struggle and budget and approval process to get a job, and then you bring the person in and you don't even have them doing stuff. I don't
Right.
get it.
And, the way I always remember or think about role conflict was, from that movie Office Space, which if you haven't
Ugh.
watched it, you just stop what you're doing and go watch it. It's funny. I mean,
And
gosh,
it
that
can be
movie,
really depressing. So I know
it
that, and I
can.
won't say the company, but I love that movie and would watch it regularly. But there was a couple years when I worked at this one place that I couldn't watch it because it was just too much like what was going on.
Right, right. Well, and it's funny because that movie's like 20 years old now, which is shocking. But anyway, this idea of role conflict, there's a scene in that movie where he says, I have 8 bosses, Bob. 8. So when I screw up, I've got 8 people coming over and telling me, right? So, when you have a conflict, you have, one person's telling you one thing, another person's telling you another. And especially if you're, junior in the organization, you're just starting out in your career, you're trying to do well. You don't want to, annoy people. You want to please people. That can be really challenging and really, really frustrating because
Yeah,
you may
like
not
make you want to get out of there. Challenging.
Yeah, right.
Uh-huh.
Because I mean, you may not feel like you have the power or the authority or to speak up about it. But I think you should. But that can be really challenging. This role conflict idea. We've also talked about some of those other drivers of voluntary turnover being how the work itself is designed, the work environment. Promotion opportunities, definitely important. How much people can participate in decision making and the communication that happens. And then just, coworker relationships and teamwork. Part of what makes work satisfying and makes work worth doing is having high quality relationships in the workplace.
Right.
People around us who, we enjoy working with, who challenge us, who respect us, who are pleasant and civil in their communication with us, that we can achieve things together with. I mean, all of that is huge because we have, as humans, these socio-emotional needs, and
And don't deny those needs. So,
right.
Or if you do, just do it for a small period of time. I need a specific amount of experience, so I'm going to put up with these jerks.
Yeah.
But there is a long-term physical and emotional toll if you don't take care of these actual human needs. And don't play to this delusion that we're just bricks in the wall. Right?
Right.
Don't be a cog in the machine. Take care of yourself, your relationships, your friendships, your partners. Everybody will benefit, as well as yourself.
That's right. That's right. And I think that's a really good place to wrap up part 1 of why people quit and how to keep them. We talked about turnover and retention, what the research says about that. We talked about those 5 myths and evidence-based strategies related to them. And we talked about some evidence-based guidelines for retention management here in part 1.
Yeah, I mean, wow, what a great topic. And we really encourage you to stay tuned for part 2.
Yes, indeed. So in part 2, we're going to talk about that unfolding model of turnover that we've referenced a couple times, as well as the ideas of organizational commitment and withdrawal from the organization. Thanks for listening to the Indigo Podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider helping us by rating us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, telling your friends about us, having us on your podcast, or mentioning us on social media. Our website is www.indigopodcast.com, where you can access more information about us and this episode. Thanks again, and we look forward to talking with you again soon.